the stories you've heard, they don't tell the whole truth. The island is indeed the place of legend. There's power and vast riches as well. But those who've gone before you have simply vanished, never heard from again. I saw the horror, the madness that overcame the crew. It was beyond any evil the world has ever known. How I survived, I do not know. The contents of this box are not of this world. They will guide you to that one, wherever and whatever that may be. Go then, Captain. Chart your course and your fate. I will say a prayer for the souls of your crew.
Mic on. Mic feedback off. Mic on. Mic feedback off. Mic on. Mic feedback off. Mic on. Mic feedback off.
On your walk back to the locker room, you made a detour to the Ring Girls. They seemed surprised, as many of us were. What was that all about?
Beautiful women is a decoration of any event, and I want people to know that. And no one have right to say that they are useless, because they are on the place where they have to be. They were here at the beginning, and it's like no matter. You will come in any event, you will see beautiful women. And you, as a man, like everyone, enjoy it. It's kind of like beautiful, right? And this is decoration. That's why this is my message, that beautiful woman, it's a decoration of any event.
Henry Cejudo said he's coming back
Henry
to take
Cejudo.
out Alexander the Average in response to him.
What do you say?
He's coming back to take out Alexander the Average.
No, mate, he's called out everyone. Like, I mean, he's called out females. He's called out, you know what I mean? Like, what, you actually believe the shit that comes out of his mouth? Nah, don't worry about him.
Thanks, man.
I'll squash the little germ.
We are in a live. Look at that.
It's in Marab.
Marab
time!
Let's
Heart
go.
of a champion right
Thank
there,
you,
buddy.
thank you. With my coaches, we're going to the hotel. We did our job the best.
Yes, Marab.
And then that was easy. We accept more crazy fight, but we take care of business always. Let's go.
Marab's the best.
Let's go.
Fuck yeah, Marab! Yeah, Marab!
Aljo is next and Al is next. Let's go. And then all team, Sarah Longo team, let's go everybody. Let's go. Thank you everybody for support. We training hard and then training hard, fight is easy always. Let's go. Thank you.
Yeah, Marab!
Thank you. I love you everybody. Thank you for support.
We're back. Much better. I think after like, what, a week? Should be good. Swelling's already dropped down drastically. It's really just, we had to get the wound. It was a little bloody. I woke up with dried up blood all in my beard and shit. But yeah. I'm happy with this, with the results. Looking class. Didn't get the finish I wanted, but you know, I had to take what was available, and it wasn't really opening up. So I had to be smart, had to be safe, and even doing all that, I still ended up eating a knee, you know.
Because of this. No, but that's learning from it. His camp is where he lives. You have to travel to train, and now COVID up every day. My mother. It was. You know what I mean? You have to learn from him. That's the key. No, brother. Learn from him. Don't be too hard on him. Learn from him. And don't. You know, it's not your fault. You know, like you're a hardworking man. You did a great job. It's well for you.
I call for, so if you look at the rankings, the only two guys that are free is Beneil and Tony Ferguson. For the last 5 minutes, Sean Shelby's been trying to get T Ferg to pick up the phone and get in there with me, and he hasn't done it. So yeah, Beneil Dariush, he's sitting there without a dance partner. He's looking for a fight. Beneil Dariush is the guy I'm looking to fight.
UFC, give me anything fighters who have to fight with me in Abu Dhabi 30 October. I show you who here really champ. Друзья, спасибо всем за вашу поддержку. Увидимся в Абу-Даби.
Somehow.
Brian Ortega might be the toughest dude in mixed martial arts, but he also suffered some serious damage tonight that could have some real concerns. Welcome back, everybody. I'm Dr. Brian Suter, and this is your #1 source for learning about the unique medical side of the world of sports. This fight certainly could have been stopped here. We saw the doctors come out to examine Ortega, and I'll admit, it kind of looked a little bit shaky in terms of how well he was doing with answering the doctor's questions, in terms of how his eyes were actually functioning. I'll be honest, the combination of seeing this significant bruising here right underneath in that kind of inferior orbital rim, and kind of the flattening that it seemed like it looked like he had on that right side of the face, definitely raises concern for the possibility of an orbital fracture. There were certainly plenty of punches that could have contributed to this, the least of which being this one here. We see Volkanovski come in, and that right lands basically square on that right eye, kind of right at that orbital rim here of Ortega, and even forces it down a little bit into the mat. There were certainly big heavy shots to Ortega's left side as well. You can see here all that energy that gets transferred impact on the left side of Ortega's face, but how the skin and everything just shifts over to the right side because of how much force was behind that punch. This was right after Ortega came back at the end of the round where he was just completely laying flat on his back and somehow managed to get up. And a couple of things here. Number one, we see this really kind of focal prominent swelling right at that inferior orbital rim. With trauma to the face and immediate kind of bruising, or what we call ecchymosis, right there under the skin, that does raise some concern in and of itself for an orbital fracture. But it also just generally looks like that right side of his face here is a little bit flat, a little bit sunken in. You might remember Billy Joe Saunders when he broke his orbital bone. You could kind of see how that right side of the face just was a little bit sunken. You kind of lost this nice full prominence of that zygomatic process because of that orbital fracture. Now Ortega's is a little bit unique because he does still have that kind of focal swelling, but that focal swelling could just be from underlying bleeding because of the fracture. We'll talk about why these are so concerning and the anatomy next, but first I want to give a shout out to the sponsor of today's video. Today's video is sponsored by Geology, a personalized men's skincare company that's completely reinventing the way that guys can take care of their skin. Skincare is science, and what you're putting on your face shouldn't feel like a gamble. Geology's products are built around powerful and proven ingredients that have been trusted by dermatologists for decades. They really take pride in what's in their products and are not filling them with a bunch of extra marketing fluff. Get started today by clicking the link in the description to take a short 30-second diagnostic quiz to make sure you're getting products that are tailored specifically for your individual needs. Whether you have sensitive skin, acne, dark puffy eyes, Geology is going to provide you with a set of products that are specific for your needs. Get started with their complete trial set to really take advantage of the full program with an everyday face wash, a Vital Morning face cream, a repairing night cream, and a nourishing eye cream. Use code Brian70 to get 70% off. This means you can get your 30-day trial set for as little as $9. Don't be intimidated anymore trying to figure out what's best for your skin, and get started today. Code Brian70 for 70% off your order and get your 30-day complete trial set for as little as $9. Thank you again to Geology for sponsoring today's video, and let's get back to our learning. Looking at our biodigital anatomy tool here, I've shown one of the eyes and I've got the other just an empty socket. The area where we see a lot of that focal swelling in Ortega is right here over an area we call the zygomatic process. It's sort of this confluence of a number of bones of the face, including the zygomatic bone right here, the mandible or the upper jaw, and then part of the temporal bone here on the back. But this is basically your cheekbone. It's what you feel here, this prominence on the side of your face. And when you get a fracture of that inferior orbital rim, you kind of get some flattening in the contour of the soft tissues coming here through your cheek. The challenging part for the doctors is, of course, in mixed martial arts, there's a lot of impacts and shots to the face. And so it can be tough to pick these up in the moment, which is why the doctors go through their exam that we'll talk about in a second. So thinking of that anatomy, that zygomatic process, nice and full here on the left side of his face, but certainly looks like everything here on the right is just a little bit flattened, a little bit sunken in there, possibly suggestive of a fracture. The reason these are so concerning is because they can cause damage to the eye. You'll see that all these little muscles that help control our eye movements basically wrap around the eyeball, but then run up along those bones of the orbit. Specifically, when we have a fracture of the inferior orbit or the lower portion of the eye socket, it can pinch this muscle called the inferior rectus. It's a muscle that when it fires, it makes our eyeballs point down. But if that muscle gets trapped within fractured bone or swelling in there, it isn't able to allow the eye to move. One of the ways we test this is by having people look up. When they look up, if that muscle below the eye is pinched, they won't be able to move the eye because it's basically anchored from the fracture. So the first thing we see the ringside doc doing here is checking extraocular movements. He's using his finger, telling Ortega to follow his finger to see if those eyes are moving in the right direction. Now, it is interesting here at the end, we saw Ortega, instead of being able to track kind of across midline there, he just turned his whole head to the side to follow the finger, which is a little bit potentially concerning that he had to do that. And also, like I said, it's really important when you're doing this that you go up and down because that's a lot more specific for that inferior orbital fracture. As we watch through this here, then the next thing the doc is going to do is something called like confrontation. He just does that quick little sudden movement to basically see if Ortega's pupil is responsive to that sort of sudden stimulus. That's one way to tell if somebody can see or not without relying on just them responding to the question. So presumably that looked okay. He does the same thing on the other side. He's asking him if he can see, which in and of itself is not very reliable in a fighter who of course wants to keep fighting. And then we see him doing some stuff with following directions. They're counting the number of fingers that he's seeing. And so you're trying to get a sense of if the fighter's able to see. But again, I would really hope that in this situation, they kind of push on that area because you can see it just looks kind of flattened. It looks like it's potentially broken here. push a little bit on that area, see if there's depression. It looks like they did it a bit here, or Herb is doing it on the left side, but check that on the right. Nevertheless, they felt comfortable with him going out and fighting, which it's hard to question that decision from just sitting at home watching. And he didn't seem to get too much more severe damage during the rest of the fight. I suspect Ortega is going to get something like a CT scan to evaluate for fractures just with as much trauma as he sustained. There's certainly no guarantee that he had one. I really hope that he didn't, because if you do, like I said, that can be more severe with permanently threatening your vision depending on how bad it is. The whole purpose of this bump on the side of your face is to help protect your eye. By having this kind of protrusion, if anything is going to strike the front of your face, generally it's going to hit the bones instead of directly hitting the eye. You'd rather the bone breaks than have severe trauma and rupture of the eyeball. So I hope the best for Ortega in his post-fight evaluations. He certainly showed some major toughness tonight to be able to compete and keep fighting through all of that trauma. Definitely seemed like a fight of the year candidate. Let me know as always any questions or comments you guys have down below. I hope this was educational. To talk a little bit through the anatomy, kind of some concerns with orbital fractures, specifically based here on what we saw with Ortega. Thanks as always for watching. And I'll see you in the next video. Bye.
Hello and welcome on in, everyone. Today I have got my first New World build for you guys. I uploaded a PvP commentary recently and you guys really liked it, so I played a whole bunch and I got enough footage to put together a build video for you guys as soon as I could. And this is my Firestaff Rapier Intelligence build. This build is very fast, it's very kitey. We've got 2 different gap closers or teleports. We've got a lot of damage over time, and then on top of it, we have got some savage backstab rapier burst. There you guys can see it. So it's pretty much a damage-oriented build, and we're going to be using all of the mobility and the dodging that we can in light armor to stay alive. Keep in mind that this is a beta build, so I don't have this guy fully leveled up. There might be some things missing to the build craft that we haven't gotten access yet to either. And of course, we've got a lot of gameplay footage at the end of the video for you guys. And I've got a link to some more gameplay footage in the description if you guys want to see it. Without further ado, let's take a look at that build. So to start off, we're going to take a look at the attribute page, and we have stacked nothing but intelligence on our attribute page. We have a little bit of points from a few other things like item buffs, etc., but for the most part, we have got just intelligence on this build. Now, the reason we've gone this route is because we scale our Firestaff and our Rapier damage off of intelligence. The first question that people are going to ask is, do you lose damage scaling with intelligence over dexterity? In short, yes, you do. You lose something like 10% damage by going the intelligence route. That being said, we're running an elemental gem on our weapon, and the elemental gem converts part of our weapon damage into a fire attack. This actually scales off of our intelligence, so the amplified damage on this gem here actually makes up for the loss of damage that we get from not going for dexterity. So at the end of the day, I actually think that this is not only a viable, but just as strong route as going for dexterity. This might actually be even stronger. You'll see in the footage, the elemental portion of our rapier damage actually does quite a lot of damage. Now you can see we also have 30 points of constitution here too. That's because our gear traits are actually a mix of intelligence and constitution. In PvP, hit points are always important. That's basically how much damage you can take before you die. And in this game especially, because your healing potions are going to scale directly off of how many hit points you have, having more hit points is incredibly beneficial. We are definitely pretty glass cannon like this. You don't have to go this high damage on the setup. You could definitely stack more points in Constitution if you wanted, for example, so you at least get 20% stronger healing on your consumables and stuff like that. But this is, of course, a beta build, so we're not even at endgame. Of course, if we were at endgame, we'd have probably the first couple of these passives anyway, and then a whole bunch of other stuff as well. As for the intelligence passives we get the plus 10% damage to light and heavy magic attacks. I don't know if this affects the elemental portion of our rapier damage. If it does, that might explain why we're dealing so much damage with it. But it does affect our fire staff on the back bar, which is great. And then the next one, we have a 10% increase to critical hit damage. This is particularly nice because you get a guaranteed critical hit when you backstab your opponent, and the rapier has a bunch of abilities that make it very easy to get behind someone and deliver those guaranteed backstabs. So this is nice for both of our outgoing damage. The fire staff as well has innately a little bit higher of a crit rate thanks to some of the passives that it gets too. All right, so let's take a look at the gear that I'm running on this guy. We're going to start off with our weapons here. We have got the Syndicate Scrivener Rapier, and we've also got the Syndicate Scrivener Fire Staff. And yeah, these are basically the weapons that you buy from the faction vendor. This is how you want to get your gear early game. There's battle leveling in PvP, so if you have gear that is around your level, then you will be pretty strong. Even if you fight a higher level player, you will actually have a fighting chance against them. Obviously, the higher level player, I think, will have advantages over you to a degree, but at least you're not going to get completely swamped. So even the level 15 gear from the vendor is going to do it for this build too. That's what I was using, honestly, till I just very recently upgraded to this stuff because I did hit level 25. Now, for the enchants on these guys, I've gone with Ignited on the Rapier, and I've gone with Electrified on Shock. From my testing, the enchant of choice here would actually just be Arcane, to have your weapons deal additional, I guess, just magic or arcane damage on the weapon. That was the strongest enchant. That being said, I haven't gotten any sapphires since I took that enchant off my old weapon, and I haven't been able to go back to it. Fire and electricity were the next best ones that I tested, so I have those on my weapons right now. We are an intelligence build. These ignited and these electrified traits will scale off of our intelligence, which basically gives it a huge amount of increased damage versus if we didn't have this trait on here. A really good choice for an intelligence-based build to go with these elemental enchants. And then these are both enchanted to increase their light and heavy attack damage by 7%. I mean, we're in the beta. You're not going to be able to have a lot of different trait choice at this point unless you've been rapidly crafting your weapons or something like that. Enchanted from the vendor is more than fine, especially on the Rapier. It's actually a pretty desired trait because a lot of our damage comes from our light and our heavy attacks. When we take a look at the gear here, we have got the full Syndicate Scrivener outfit as well. And then I've got a mix of the medium and the light armor here too. Again, if you have the level 15 gear, thanks to the battle leveling, that will work out more than fine. And when we take a look at the traits on these guys here, I've actually retraded them all to the Occultist. When you go to the faction gear vendor, they actually sell seals that allow you to change the constitution and intelligence traits to whatever you want them to be on that particular gear. It's very cheap to buy them, and it's very easy to upgrade them. It costs a little bit of Azoth to do, but if you've been playing the game and killing things, you should be able to generate the Azoth you need to fairly easily trait out all of this gear to the trait of choice. And this is all Constitution Intelligence because we need to be having as much intelligence as possible for damage. Constitution as our secondary stat, hit points very important in a PvP environment. When we did retrait the gear, it changed it all to Resilient. Now, this is not a bad trait for PvP. Critical hits will deal a total of almost 20% less damage to me with this armor set on, making it a very useful set against an opponent who's going to do something like backstab you. I don't think a lot of people are going to have like crazy crit builds this early in the game or anything, but you know, for a beginner build, I think this is awesome because backstab is a guaranteed crit, and this helps soak up the damage from that 100%. And then we've got a whole bunch of random gems on here. I just went with whatever could reduce elemental physical damage. This was a good choice because it was both of them. Ideally, I think there is more physical damage in the game, so having more physical damage reduction would be better. And then on top of it, we've got some thrust absorption as well, and some strike absorption from the 2 gems here. Pretty much just put whatever defensive gems you have that makes sense. All of them aren't terrible options. I would say maybe stick away from specific elemental damage reduction, but strike, thrust, absorption, you can't go wrong with that in PvP. You got a lot of people using a variety of different physical
Hey guys, how's it going? It's Baggins here, and today I want to share with you guys a really cool build that I have been using to level up for the past, well, 48 levels basically. I've been using Hatchet Lifestaff pretty much from the start. Every now and again I'll whip out the Ice Gauntlet for dungeons and stuff, but I think if you are leveling up solo like myself and you would like to go a little bit fast and you would like to do something a little bit different, because let's face it, pretty much everybody's using the musket, the rapier, the warhammer, but nobody's using the Lifestaff. And honestly, I think this weapon's really cool. It's got a lot of potential and you can pull off some really cool stuff with it. So I'll show you guys what my leveling build is here. This is a solo leveling PvE build, so if you want to do some PvP and stuff, let me know in the comments down below and I'll share with you guys my PvP stuff. Also, if you want the answer right now, come on into the stream. I'm happy to discuss all types of different builds with you guys. If you've got anything that you want to bounce off me, if you're looking for any recommendations in a particular avenue, once again, link to the stream in the description down below. It'd be great to see you guys there. We are live 12 hours a day, every day for the closed beta. So yeah, we're also giving out a free copy of the game as well. So if you want to play the game, you want to give a copy to a friend, we've got a lot going on in the stream. But with that being said, back to the build. So first of all, the Lifestaff. This is where it comes in. What are we rocking with the Lifestaff? We're going all out focus in terms of attributes. So focus is the only way that you're really going to increase your healing. Your healing is also increased by the quality of your Lifestaff, and my Lifestaff honestly is not that great right now. It's like 13 levels below my actual level, so I do need to upgrade this thing, but we still managed to get some pretty crazy stuff done with it. But yeah, we're all in on the focus right now, and I'm gonna keep putting points into focus until I get to 300, at which point I might put some points into strength for the extra melee weapon attacks if I do continue to run this build. But yeah, that's how our attribute points are divvied up. Pretty straightforward, just everything in focus, so you get some big fat heals. And then from the weapon mastery standpoint, you need, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 points into the Lifestaff to really make this work, but obviously more is going to be better. And the main way that this build works is we start off with Absolved just because we need to get down to Sacred Ground, and we're going to fully max out Sacred Ground. The real like sort of pierce to resistance of this build comes at the last buff of Sacred Ground here, where you receive 50% more healing from all different types of healing, including your beacon and including the healing that we're going to be getting from the hatchet as well. So you don't need these buffs on the beacon. They are pretty handy, especially the one that makes it last 5 seconds longer, but you don't have to get this if you don't have the levels. You just need beacon to start with. So that is what things are looking like on the Lifestaff side of things. And then going over to the hatchet, which is what you'll be swapping to actually kill the enemies, we're just basically looking to max out the Berserk tree. So you're going to need 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 levels with your hatchet to get it fully maxed out. And the beauty of this comes in this pip and this pip down here. So this one says, when Berserk is active, gain a portion of your health back every 5 seconds. The amount of health gained is increased by how long Berserk is active. So you're going to keep healing the longer Berserk is active. And of course, as you remember, our Sacred Ground increases all healing we receive from all different sources, including Berserk. So there's a crazy wombo combo with that. And then the last one over here says, while you're in Berserk, you can't be interrupted and you can't be staggered. Now this is pretty handy because when we put our heal down on the ground and we want to stand in it, if the enemy has some sort of CC, they could potentially like knock you out of it, and then you got to try and walk back into it, and then they knock you out of it, and that's going to severely limit your healing. And that's basically what this build is all about. You're just out healing all of the damage that comes at you. If you do have a few extra points to spend, especially with the hatchet, I would recommend maybe picking up some of the abilities. So I've got Raging Torrent here. I've also got Fortifying Strikes. So if you land 3 attacks, you get 15% damage absorption. That's going to be pretty good, make you just a little bit tankier. There's also this one here. When you land 3 attacks, you get 30% increased damage as well. And then finally, if we really want to min-max the build, I recommend putting an Amber Gem into your hatchet. If you guys don't know what the gems are, because I do find a few people don't understand the gem system yet, you can make these at the stone cutting bench. So if you're at the, this isn't a stone cutting bench, hold on. She baited me that. Here is the stone cutting bench. So these are available pretty early on. For instance, I can make a emerald here. You just need the flawed version of it, and then you can like cut it to make it nice and clean, which allows you to then socket it into your weapon. So amber is the one that you want to be looking for. You can find this when you're mining iron, when you're mining silver. It comes out of ore veins, as it says, and you will need some motes to sort of combine with it. You can also buy these off of the auction house, and they come at different tiers as well. So at the highest tier, we have the cut Brilliant Amber. There it is. This isn't the highest tier, actually. This is tier 4. But you can see it adds a lot of extra weapon to your damage based on your focus stat. And obviously you have a lot of points in focus, so it's going to add a lot of nature damage to your hatchet. If you really want to min-max, you want to look for a hatchet that has the chain lightning effect on it. This one has a backstab damage, which is going to be pretty useless for me. But there is like a chain lightning. It says fire or lightning or void, like bounces between the enemy. It's pretty strong when you get one of those. Let's see if we can, do we get one here? Nope. I mean, that was going to be like a 1 in 1,000. But yeah, hatchet with focus gem, ideally with the stats. Armor-wise, I am choosing to keep a light equip load, so I'm just staying under the light equip load. So I've got heavy boots, actually, but then I have light leg wear, light medium gloves, light chest wear, and light headwear. So medium, heavy, and then the rest is light. You can do some combination of this in any order. You ideally want to run like a heavy or a medium piece, because then you can gain a little bit of extra armor while still staying getting the light equip bonus, which is 20% extra damage, and you get that cool dodge roll. I think for the purpose of playing solo, you basically just want to kill the enemies as fast as possible. There's no real reason to sort of drag the combat out. And I know you could say, well, why are you playing heal staff then? But I'll show you. You can actually go really fast with the heal staff. So if you have a quest to kill like 15 skeletons or kill 10 lost ghouls or something, what you can do is just gather them all up at the same time and then burn them all down at the same time. And if you don't believe me, let's go ahead over here, find some enemies, and I can show you just exactly how much we can take in one go. Okay, so here we go. We're gonna go and gather up a bunch of these lost here. Now, I do have a bit of a level advantage on these guys, so it's not exactly like a fair comparison, but trust me, even at the same level as me, I can like take quite a beating here. So I'm gonna go ahead and set my beacon up over there, because that's where I'm gonna pull to. Put the sacred ground on there. We're gonna dodge roll into it, pop the berserk, and then we're just gonna go for it. And if you look at my health bar, it's going down for sure, but then it's just going back up straight away. As long as I can manage to keep myself in the circle, the health bar is, it's going down and it's coming back up at the straight time. And we just killed like, I don't know, what was that, 10 things at the same time there? So you can imagine that in any instance where you have to go in and like clear out a bunch of enemies in one go, it's just gonna save you time rather than doing it like individually, pull one and then kill it, and then pull one and then kill it. You can just plonk down, mega heals on the ground, pull out the hatchet, go berserk, and just heal through all the damage. I guess as you're moving forward, like it does, doing the animation does actually make you go forward a little bit. Like if we just do this, we're slowly gonna move towards the lake. So you do have to be wary about that. Maybe like turn your character around every now and again just so you don't end up walking out of the circle, because as soon as you walk out the circle, you're in a lot of danger. One thing that's worth mentioning about the hatchet as well, we did get a level with it there, and I am going to go ahead and put it into the other damaging ability. Eventually with the hatchet, once you get enough points into it, you can get Defy Death, and that says when you receive lethal damage, avoid death, reduce to 50 HP, and gain immortality for 3 seconds. So you actually can't die. Like, you literally cannot die with this build. It's got a 75-second cooldown, but that, you know, if you're going for a big crazy pull, then it's probably going to be 70, you know, a minute or so until you do the next big pull. So yeah, I just think this is a really fun build. I don't see too many people using the life staff to much effectiveness. So if you guys think this is a cool one, let me know in the comments down below. Also, go ahead and click that like button. Subscribe for more. If you want to
Swole Benji here. Today we are doing a healer build. Now this is an all-in focus healer build that will never run out of mana, that will have the most cooldown reduction possible in the entire game, so that you can spam heals. You will be able to fully heal entire groups of players very quickly, and the healing scales insanely in this game. You're going to heal, like one cast will fully heal most of your party and most of your tank's HP. So let's get into it. So obviously you're going to put everything into focus, all 190 points that you get in the game. Dump them all into focus. It's that simple. All right, next slide. So this is your spec. Now this is Light's Embrace, Divine Embrace, and Sacred Ground. Now I know a lot of people really like Beacon, and I know they like Orb of Protection. Here's the thing. Your tank, if built properly and played properly, will not need Orb of Protection at all. Orb of Protection is a huge chunk and waste of points. You don't need Beacon because it's basically a tickle. Once you have these abilities and these perks that I'm going to show you on the next slides, it completely outclasses Beacon, Orb of Protection, and even Splash of Light, though Splash of Light is actually really good for PvP. Alright, so here's how it works. You take this first skill right here. This makes your light and heavy attacks completely free. Then you take Sacred Ground, you max that out. You can get these two if you want, if you're doing dungeons. Otherwise, you definitely want to put 1 point into Light's Embrace, and then come over here, get 2 passives, get Divine Embrace. And you don't need this passive, which will give your tank 25 stamina, or whichever target you decide to heal with, which you really should only use this ability on your tank anyway. And then you just fill out the rest of the tree here on the left. You get the ultimate here. And most of these passives just are either cooldown reduction based, or they are % healing increases. Alright, and that's pretty much it. This one here, this little armor icon, what it does is when you deal a heavy attack on a mob, you'll get Fortify. And then this one here, when you have a buff on you, you will have 10% more healing. So they synergize. That's why we went this route. Alright, so you can pause the video if you want to take a look at the spec here. Otherwise, I'm moving on. Okay, so this is the gear. Alright, and you're going to go all focus on your gear. So 30 focus on your weapon, 25 focus on your armor pieces. So here's how it works. You're going to be using a Pristine Diamond to get 15% more healing. You're going to use Blessed for 28% more healing. You're going to use Refreshing Move because every attack that you do is going to reduce your cooldowns. Siphoning Blow, every 28 seconds, you basically fully heal your mana, okay? You're going to be chunking enemies really hard. A light attack is going to do like 2,000 to 4,000 damage, okay? Heavy attacks are like really, really hard hitting. You're like a glass cannon healer. You will be doing tons of damage, okay? So you're going to get these 3 perks. It's actually a lot easier to craft this weapon than other weapons I've covered on the channel because of the percentage chance to roll the perks and the focus. 30% chance to roll 30 focus on a healing item. That's really nice. For your armor, obviously focus again. You're going to have 1 of these perks for refreshing. They do not stack, so only get 1 on your armor pieces. And that just reduces your cooldowns by 2.8%. It doesn't sound like much, but it is absolutely necessary. You're also going to use Carnelian Gems because not only are you going to hit really hard, you're basically an off DPS. That's the main healer. And you stack 8 of these, which is going to give you 80% less threat. If you wanted to stack it to 100, you can, and you will absolutely never pull aggro. Though, the way that works, at least in the alpha testing, is if someone aggroes a mob and they do not hit them, and then you hit them, you will aggro them, even with 100% less threat generation. However, if they hit them 1 time, and then you hit them like 10 times, you will never pull aggro. It's kind of broken. But you don't need it. Just get 80%, and you're good to go. Next, you're going to get Refreshing Evasion. So when you evade, when you dodge, you gain like 20% healing. So you're going to be using your dodge to buff up your heal spells. You don't really have to, but it's just nice to have. So that's going to give you more cooldown reduction. Then you're going to get Divine Embrace. So if you heal someone below 50% life, it reduces the cooldown by 46%. We'll talk about that later. And then Fortifying Sacred Ground, which will give you Fortify on all your targets, which is a 14% boost. And the reason, guys, the reason we don't use Orb of Protection, which is what a lot of people recommend, is because the tank, there was a nerf not too long ago. The maximum Fortify percentage you can get is 50%, okay? Tanks have so many options to hit 50% on their own, but even when that's down, you're going to give them 14% from this. You don't need to also give them 20% from Orb of Protection. They have their own means to get Fortify, and since it caps at 50%, Orb of Protection is a huge waste, okay? And Sacred Ground is way too strong. Divine Embrace is way, way too strong. And then finally, Light's Embrace. You don't have to get this one. It's just kind of, it's just nice to have for your tank or other party members. It gives them haste, 23% move speed for 3 seconds. It's not a lot, but it's nice to have. Your party will enjoy you if you have this. So for the bag, obviously you get Luck, Extra Pockets. You can get Azoth Attuned. Yeah, you can get any perk you want, really. The bag doesn't matter. It doesn't really help you heal. So for the amulet, these are my choices. You can also go defensive choices. Purify is just too damn strong. If you get dropped below 50% HP, it cleanses all your debuffs. So if you're fighting a raid boss and they bleed you for like, 3,000 damage a tick, this will save your life. So, and then health, 9.4% more HP. Super good to have. I recommend it for everybody. More health means you won't get freaking one-shotted, okay? Mana recovery. So if you hit below 50% HP, you will recover 95 mana. And we'll talk more about how much mana you'll have later. So this recovers a ton of mana. It's just nice to have if all your other ways to recover mana fail or are messed up or anything. But generally, you don't really need this one. You can put whatever you want. Earrings. Focus. 9.5 mana regeneration per tick. That's huge. That's 2 ticks is a spell cast, okay? Healthy Toast means that you gain HP when you drink a mana potion, which sometimes in in-game raids you will need to drink mana potions, believe it or not. And then Refreshing Toast gives you 28% potion cooldown reduction, so that by the time you do run out of mana again, and if all your other mana regeneration fails, like your auto attacks, because you might have to be spamming heals.
Charging battery.
You won't be able to do any light or heavy attacks on the enemies. So this just comes in handy. You can also use Duplicating Toast so you get your potion back 14% of the time. Again, it's up to you. Then for rings, you have Siphoning, which is another mana leech, because the one on your weapon is a 28-second cooldown. However, the one on your ring is a 10-second cooldown, okay? And then you have Brilliance, which gives you 9.5% maximum mana, and Sacred, which gives you 8.5% more heal power. All right, so that is it. You're going to be using mana and focus potions and an energizing ration to keep your mana up, though you don't really need the ration, to be honest. If you happen to be just a spammer for spells, this is what you would use. I personally spam spells. I believe that the tank, you should always keep them topped off because they do have a passive where they get a ton of reduced damage when they are at maximum HP, so you should always be fully healing them all the time. Like, the second someone takes like 10% damage of their life, I'm healing them. And with this build, you will be able to spam spells and never run out of mana. So here's the stats, right? You will have 445 focus with a very basic food buff. I didn't include the legendary food buff. I don't know why anyone would spend tons of, I almost said silver, coins to buy a legendary fish for a 40, like you get 20 more focus. Whoop-de-frickin' do. That's 20% more healing because focus scales at a 1-to-1 ratio. All right, so because you maxed out and you got 300 focus, you're going to have mana regeneration, maximum mana, healing, applied 20% longer buffs, 30 mana on kill, or if your group kills something, if you're just in a party and someone kills something, boom, 30 mana, easy. And then when your mana reaches 0, you gain 200% mana regeneration, which is actually kind of broken. It doesn't really work right now. And then you can just pause the video. I'm not going to list every single one of these. I'm not going to read them out to you. I'm not your school teacher. You can read this yourself. Pause the video if you want to see. Up here at the top right, this is what you get from your weapon mastery. I only listed the healing ones, not anything else. And then in the middle of the screen is what you get from your items and perks. As you can see, it's really nice. Now let's go to the next one where we talk about everything stacked up and how this works. So in the end, you're going to have 231.5% increased healing. At level 60, you can be expected to have 5.5 to 6.5 thousand health. You will have 131 mana, 10% which will regenerate all the time, which is 13.1, which is almost a full cast. You will instantly fill your mana bar with a light attack every 10 or 28 seconds. Let's see, you have 210% mana regen if you hit 0 mana. You have a total of 21.55% cooldown reduction, and every time you use a light attack, you'll get 5% more if you hit an enemy. Now, your Divine Embrace will have a 67.55% cooldown reduction, okay, which is a 1.9 second cooldown, okay? It's super powerful, and you have 80% reduced threat. Now, if you need to cleanse your allies, you just use a heavy attack on them, okay? And your free heal, if they're just very slightly injured, you just use your light attack on them. That's a 20% heal. Now, I don't know how much it will heal with this build, okay? There's no way anyone's going to be able to fill out this complete build for possibly the first year of the game unless you get insanely lucky with craft. But a 540 gear score player will be able to heal with their light attack for 800 damage, or I'm sorry, 800 healing. That's how much they're going to heal you for, okay? And you just go pew, 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 and it's really easy to heal people in this game, guys. It's too easy, actually. Now, if you run out of mana, a light attack will fully restore it. If you run out of mana again, a potion restores it. And if you run out again, well, you have 210% mana regeneration. So you're never going to go out of mana with this build, okay? And you will never aggro enemies with this build either. So unless your tank sucks. If you have a shitty tank, then sorry, it's over. So now your gear score, a gear score of 540 in a level 66 in-game dungeon who doesn't have these perks or gear, who is a 75-25 split of focus and constitution, Their Sacred Ground will heal for 800 a tick, which is 20% of your weapon damage, same as your light attack, and applies a 14% fortify. Also applies stamina and mana regeneration. You always want to cast Sacred Ground on your tank so that he can regenerate stamina. That is super important for these in-game raids. It is your tank's stamina, which is part of your job as a healer to make sure that they don't run out of breath, okay? And this has a 15.69 second cooldown. The base is 20% or 20 seconds, but with your cooldown reduction of 21%, it knocks it down to 15. And every time you light attack something, it goes down like 1 or 2 seconds, so it's pretty dang good. Now, this same person with this gear score of 540, their Divine Embrace would heal for 6,000, which, if that target is below 50%, it will spread to another target. And if that target is below 50%, it will spread to the last target. So the meta for DPS is having 3 Great Axes all clumped together so that if any of them drop below 50, you just click that, or you don't click it, you mouse wheel scroll to their life bar, you hit your Divine Embrace, and boom, your whole party's fully healed again. Okay? Just about except for the tank. But also, the reason you have Great Axe melee DPS is because it's the highest DPS in the game in dungeons, and because they can stack on the tank, which stacks on Sacred Ground, so no one ever dies. Alright? So Light's Embrace, with no buffs, is going to heal for 4,000 on the tank. And when I say no buffs, I mean if the tank has no buffs, okay? But your average in-game raid PvE dungeon tank Chad is going to have 7 buffs on him, okay? And if you do the math, that means your heal now hits him for 12,400 at 540 gear score. And a tank will have about 15 to 16,000 health at 560 gear score. All right? So you got to constantly cast this on the tank anyway to give him more stamina so that he doesn't get block staggered. And it has a 3.19 second cooldown. Now, if you are hit by an in-game boss's AoE attack, you're going to survive it in light armor with about 1,000 HP remaining. And you can cast a heal on yourself to trigger all of those less than 50% HP buffs. All right? So Light's Embrace is for your tank because it gives him stamina. And it stacks with all of his buffs. So you're going to be healing him for almost all of his health in one cast. All right? Divine Embrace is for your DPS and for yourself, which has a shorter cooldown, and if you're less than 50%, it jumps to a nearby ally within 8 meters, which is not a lot. You pretty much have to be standing next to someone. And then Sacred Ground is for your tank, and if you have all Great Axe DPS, which you should, that's the meta, everyone's in the Sacred Ground, okay? So that's the build. That's the healing build. This is a shorter vid. That's fine. Anyway, guys, I know, like, a lot of people are like, oh, you got to use heavy armor. No, you don't have to use heavy armor, okay? As the healer, you just stand in the back, okay? You just watch out for AoEs, which you can dodge. The game tells you when they're coming, and you can... it's really simple, guys. Like, healing in this game is just too damn easy. It's the easiest job in the game. It's not whack-a-mole like other games, okay? Anyway, I'm Soul Benji. Thanks for watching. As always, be a bro and stay swole. Make sure you leave a like and a comment. You got to do both. It is a YouTube cheat code. It is an algorithm combo. 80% of you watch these videos and aren't subscribed. All right? Only 20% of my subscribers are watching this. So, guys, hit that subscribe button. Let's get to 50,000. Help me out. I really do appreciate it. I have medical bills I need to pay. Please, please subscribe. Anyway, I'm not going to beg. I do appreciate you watching. I make videos every day, so I will see you in tomorrow's video.
There are currently 11 weapons in New World that you can make use of, with some recent additions like Ice Gauntlet or the Lunging Rapier. That was a big step forwards. Okay, that was a bad joke, I'll admit. And you can equip any 2 of them at one time. But despite the wide range of possible combos that opens up, they can all essentially be broken down into really 3 or 4 class types. Those really being tank, DPS, or healer. And realistically, I would clump anything else sort of other than that and really consider it to be a hybrid. Now, a few words on hybrids before we really get stuck into each of the 3 classes. Generally speaking, although there are some obvious exceptions which we'll talk about later, for min-maxing builds, hybrids tend to be a bad example. This, an example of this might be something like taking Sword and Shield and then going half tank, half DPS. You sort of end up in a situation that doesn't really fulfill every role. However, not everyone here is going to be playing super competitively. Not everyone cares about the meta and min-maxing, and if that's you, that is absolutely fine. But it is good to try and understand the decisions you're making and remember the impact it's going to have on your character. And at the end of the day, you can always respec or change weapon if you change your mind later on. Next up, I want to briefly talk about attributes and basically how to spec them. This is obviously going to depend a lot on your class and build, but you're going to get 190 attribute points just from leveling once you hit to level 60. But with the addition of high-end gear, I'd expect that you're going to be getting to around 500 total attribute points to play with. So you should be able to fully spec one of your attributes to around 300 and get most of a second attribute, which is part of the reason why good gear is so important. And it's good gear that is specific to the attributes that you want. However, it is also worth bearing in mind that there is an element of diminishing returns for attributes. If you take, say for example, Constitution, that starts by giving you 25 hit points per attribute point at the low levels. But that gradually decreases as you spend more attribute points down to 21 hit points per level for the higher attribute point levels. Yes, it's still good, the diminishing return rate isn't that harsh, but you are losing some of its effectiveness. Finally, it's obviously just worth pointing out that you also get a fixed bonus for every 50 attribute points up to 300. For example, at 50 dexterity you get a plus 10% critical hit chance and plus 10 skinning speed. And finally, you can respec your attribute points for free up until level 20. Beyond that, it's going to be costing you coin. So let's kick things off then with the tank. You've really got two primary objectives as a tank. This is the obvious one, tanking. Of course, the clue is kind of in the name. But more importantly, it's actually going to be getting and holding the enemy's aggro through New World's threat system. For every hit you land, you'll generate a small amount of threat, pretty much based on the damage you apply. However, with Sword and Shield, you can make a use of abilities like Shield Bash or Defender that increase the amount of threat you generate. You can also combine this with a Carnelian Gem equipped to your weapon to increase your threat, and give some abilities things like Taunt. This will then allow you to attack and hold enemies aggro indefinitely. This is honestly one of the most important things you can do. There's no point being a tank if all the enemies are attacking your healer, because, for example, other members in the group, like the healer, would generate significant amounts of threat via healing. So you need to be generating more threat than your healer, which is why things like the Carnelian Gem and making use of Shield Bash and Defender are so important. Now, in terms of weapon mastery, I'm not going to cover weapon mastery for each and every weapon, otherwise this video will go on for ages, and we actually have a separate video just on builds already out there. But since tank class is basically built on Sword and Shield, it kind of is worth taking a little bit of a look at it for this specific one. So, broadly speaking, we've got the sort of defensive side and a little bit of offensive on the Swordmaster side. Now there's two key abilities on this side, Shield Bash and Defender. So as we were saying, they are both Carnelian Gem compatible. So if you have a Carnelian Gem slotted into your sword's gem slot, then you'll basically gain Taunt, which basically draws all the enemies to you, and that'll run for 6 seconds, which is exactly what you want to be doing. You're the tank, that's the whole point. But on top of that, as we head down the Shield Bash line, we get an increased threat generation from using the Shield Bash, and you get a little bit of an extended bash, which is just nice to have from a combat point of view. Beyond that, we're either looking at defensive or taunt-based abilities. So more damage and cause more threat on your final blow. Again, useful generating that threat. A little bit of defensive, ally support stuff. Then we move over to Defender or Defiant Stance. Then this has Taunt Gem compatible. So when you activate the ability, if you have a Carnelian Gem in your sword, it's going to cause Taunt, going to draw all those enemies to you, which is hugely useful. And the rest of the stuff is just about basically increasing the effectiveness of the ability. Flicking over to the Swordmaster side, This is your Whirling Blade. This is the one that's actually going to do a little bit of damage. Still not going to be crazy damage. The tank as a class is not about damage, but it's nice to have a little bit of versatility, which is why I think it's worth having a few specs down here. Just gives you a little bit of extra damage and a little bit more sort of flexibility in how you play the class. So that's how I would run it. But for me, it's all about generating the taunt and the threat, which is what the Shield Bash and the Defender actually do, and that's what makes them so key. So what about attributes for the tank class? Well, it's Constitution, Constitution, and more Constitution, really. You're all about taking damage and staying alive, not really dishing it out. So ideally, you'll be looking to end up with at least 300 points in Constitution. As for sort of any spare points beyond that, you have a few options available to you. Sword and Shield scales primarily off of strength. So if your secondary weapon is going to be something like maybe a Great Axe, a Warhammer, both of which are great secondaries for a tank due to their really high base damage output without being sort of overly reliant on attributes for the damage. But then if you do spec a few extra points of strength into it, that could make them a really good option. And we see quite a few swords and shields with Great Axes and Warhammers. A further option though could be one of my many sort of hybrid exceptions, would be to go Life Staff as a secondary, and so spec your secondary attribute as Focus. I'd try and get a T5 Focus gem as well for my sword to convert a percentage of its damage to basically scale off of Focus, so that at least you're getting some extra damage boost out of the Focus attribute. This sort of heavy armor healing tank is what Sir Medieval has been playing and sort of is calling a paladin. However, in the recent open beta testing, this class suffered a pretty hefty nerf, with healing whilst wearing heavy armor now only giving 80% of the previous healing amount. You have to be basically wearing light armor to get 100%. Along with also nerfs to the T5 Amber Focus gems, it's kind of put a fair dent in this as a class because it certainly was very popular. But hopefully this at least highlights that even as a tank, there are quite a few different options available to you for you to pick from. I guess since we just covered a healer tank hybrid, it makes sense for us to move on to the healer next. I suppose in many ways the tank and healer are two easier classes to spec, at least weapon wise, as your primary is always going to be Sword and Shield for tank and Life Staff for healer. But given the recent changes to healing and armor weight as we just talked about above, it is perhaps more safe to assume now that we're going to at least see a lot more light armor healers in the game compared to the sort of very heavy armor orientated healers that we've had before. The goal of the healer is in itself pretty self-explanatory. It's all about keeping your group alive, making sure your tank who has got the aggro of everything in the room is kept up. Identifying who is getting targeted quickly in a war. In those 50v50 wars, once that group of muskets starts turning on a player, they will chunk down super quickly. You've got to be quick in getting your heals out, getting your AoE heals out, and making sure that you keep them up. That's really what being a healer is all about. So in terms of mastery for the Life Staff, there are actually a couple of options open and available to you, perhaps slightly depending on what armor type you're going to be going. But to cover the two perhaps more standard ones first, of Beacon and Sacred Ground, these are your two AoE abilities. So Sacred Ground, that's the sort of big sort of greenish glowing circle that, when you stand in it, that's what's going to do heal yourself, your allies, basically turning an area of ground into healing. And the passives associated with it are basically extending that, both on Sacred Ground and also on Beacon. Its area of effect, the amount it does, the time and duration that it lasts, all affected by this. Elsewhere, passives are smaller things just affecting the Life Staff in general. Light and heavy attacks no longer take mana, super useful. Stuff when heavy attacks pass through allies, it removes a debuff. There's another ally one when your light attack, so when you're shooting basically into a cluster, if you pass your light attack through and hit an enemy, then it also heals your own ally. Super useful in large scale PvP, wars, stuff like that. It becomes a really invaluable passive, and that's where these are really handy. Then I would say you've kind of got two options. If you're a fairly light armor healer, you've not really got much tank, you've not got much spec into Constitution, you're wearing light armor, then I think Divine Embrace is probably the way to go. It gives you a high rapid casting instant heal, basically like an emergency heal that you can make use of. Really kind of handy to have, and it can actually, once you spec it out, end up healing up to 3 people if you're pretty low on health. It basically rebound heals, so if you're below 50% health, then it will heal someone within 8 meters of you, and then if that person's below 50% health, they heal someone with 8 meters of them, so it like rebounds, so you can heal up to 3 people effectively with it. Really, really handy to have and very useful. I think if you're much more tanky, then I think Orb of Protection is also a viable option. Gives you that nice fortify and the healing, really kind of nice to have. And if you're using, say, like Life Staff and maybe Sword and Shield, or Life Staff and another melee weapon like a Great Axe or something, then you can basically shoot yourself, get that fortify for 20 seconds, flick over to the Great Axe, and then you've got that fortify on you. It's really nice to have, so you're going into melee with already a boost. But there's a couple of options, I think, available to you. It kind of depends slightly, I think, on how tanky you're going to be going as a Life Staff user. Finally, we come to attribute points, and I guess, as before, it's pretty self-explanatory that you're going to be wanting to stick the vast bulk of your attribute points into focus. Probably around 75% until you get to around 300, then I'll be looking to probably put any remaining attribute points into Constitution. Particularly if you're going to be like a light armor healer, you can get chunked down really quite quickly by muskets. You might not be able to get your emergency self heals on in time. Particularly, and again, I know I keep referring back to this, particularly if you get involved in the 50v50 territory wars, you will get chunked down pretty fast and you will actually be a target. Finally, we come on to the, I guess, fairly all-encompassing class of sort of quote-unquote DPS. Really, it's a very broad definition in this game, as there are a really large selection of weapons, well, 9 of them, that really could be categorized as DPS. But in reality, many of them play pretty radically different. Maybe you like the idea of a spear with a strong amounts of crowd control, musket or bow to get that good amounts of ranged damage. If you want a bit more of a support DPS, then maybe something like Ice Gauntlet or Fire Staff. Both offer very large amounts of AoE damage. Can be great in large skirmishes. Rapier, really large amounts of raw DPS with the addition of criticals and evades. Or maybe you just want to cleft someone in twain with the Great Axe. So I guess you could ask the question of, well, why am I sticking them all under the same sort of DPS label? Well, predominantly it's down to their attributes build. Because unless you are planning on running weapon hybrids, i.e. weapons that don't share the same primary or secondary attribute, then in most cases I would be looking to put probably 75% of my attribute points into a single damage attribute. By this I mean, say, strength for Great Axe or dexterity for spears, because all of these 9 weapons are really focused towards doing damage in one form or another, like we talked about above. Maybe it's because of AoE or maybe it's through crowd control, but they're all damage orientated. Yes, you could go much more heavily into Constitution, for example, but fundamentally it comes down to the problem of why would you then not just use Sword and Shield? If you want to make yourself tough and tanky, it is hands down the better weapon for it. But to sort of counter my own argument a little bit here, and as I said a little bit at the start, lots of different builds will emerge based on people's playstyle and kind of what they want to achieve and how they want to play the game. And this is just a rough idea of how I'd group the classes and kind of how some of the fundamentals work. There are lots of hybrid options available, and that is what makes the game so cool. But it is kind of helpful to bear in mind that these 3 classes are sort of like your starting point. Build your classes out from here and just keep in mind a little bit about how they work and how they're kind of broadly grouped. Ideally, be trying to pick weapons that share the same primary attribute. Spear and musket, hatchet or great axe, as if you pick 2 weapons that have opposing attributes, say Warhammer and Ice Gauntlet, then you're really limiting your ability to get good damage out of either weapon. And if nothing else, I'd really like this to be your main takeaway from this video. But anyway, I have rambled on for more than long enough. If you've even made it this far, you've done very well. And hopefully the video has given you at least a little bit more of an idea about which class and weapons you might want to pick going forwards. If you have any questions about builds or classes, put them in the comments down below and I will get back to you. Lots more New World content on the way, so do subscribe, and I shall see you all on the next one. Hi everyone, hope you're all doing well and welcome back to another video on Amazon's New World. So when I was doing my beginner's guide last week, I did say that I would actually go on to cover each of the weapons, which builds I would use with them and which perks I might recommend taking. Well, here we are. So I'm going to kind of broadly break this video down into 3 categories: tank builds, DPS builds, and, well, the healer class. Now, of course, this is by no means going to be a definitive guide. The fact that you can take 2 weapons, and in any combination, since there are no real sort of classes as such, means there are quite a few options and combinations you can pick from. You can also, of course, spec into what I'd call sort of a hybrid build, but you are going to lose some efficiency. And particularly if you're planning to get quite heavily involved in PvP, territory wars, you know, the guild war system, to be owning land in Aeternum, then it is probably going to put you at somewhat of a disadvantage. And just for clarity, I would kind of consider a hybrid build to be something like taking the sword and shield as a weapon, but spacking your attribute points in it into strength for damage, or, you know, a 50-50 split, rather than trying to focus on constitution to improve its tanking ability. I'm going to kick things off by running through the various DPS classes and some builds. And I guess we probably shouldn't even be calling them classes, weapons would probably be more appropriate. But just before that, I wanted to briefly cover attribute points, because once you hit level 60, you're going to have 180 attribute points to spend. But you can expect to get at least as many again from gear, which is why getting the right gear can play such a huge part in the effectiveness of your build. It's also worth mentioning that basically, well, all of the attributes have a soft cap of 300. Beyond that, the extra points only make a very small difference, and there are no further perks to be gained. So generally, once you hit 300, that's the point you're going to be wanting to stop. And whilst we're touching on perks, yes, for every 50 points that you put into your attributes, you'll be getting a bonus perk. That's a bonus perk at 50, 100, 150, 200, 250 and 300. And yes, they stack. For example, strength at 50 gives you increased damage to melee weapons light attack, as well as plus 10% increased mining speed. Then say at 250, you continue to get stamina regeneration while performing light and heavy attacks, and so on with all the other perks across up until 300. Now, in terms of how you are going to spend your attribute points, now I'm not going to give you an example of every possible combination for each class build, but instead I'm going to give you broad percentages of how I would aim to build a class. For example, if you are running a DPS class, then I would be looking to put around 75% of my attribute points into damage. So by that I mean strength, dexterity or intelligence, depending on if you're using melee weapons, ranged weapons or magic. I'm going to cover a little bit about how some weapons scale off 2 attributes, but for now, just think of these 3 attributes as damage attributes, just relevant to the melee, range or magic, depending on which weapon you're going to be using. And then the remaining 25% of your attribute points are going to be wanting to go into constitution. This really does kind of become a requirement, because it gives you some element of survivability, some element of buffer to keep yourself in the fight. And no DPS can just be an ultimate glass cannon, because, well, you just don't really about damage, you're about absorbing damage. So your damage output really isn't that important. That's why I've gone so heavily focused towards constitution. Then finally, if you're going to be working as a healer, I think I'd be looking to go somewhere between 75 to 100% into focus. It depends slightly, in my opinion, on how involved in PvP and wars you are going to be. If you're just going to be running around doing PvE stuff, expedition, bosses, then realistically you probably can get away with 100% focus. You can really avoid all the damage and keep yourself out of the fight. So long as you've got a good tank in your group who's going to keep that aggro, keep that threat, then you should be okay. But in wars, things do get a little bit more difficult. That extra 25% into constitution can be really helpful in giving yourself sort of some element of buffer, particularly if the enemy team starts to focus you down. Anyway, that's enough talk about attribute points. Let's kick things off with the first weapon, and I want to start with the hatchet. a single-handed axe that actually fits in pretty well with a lot of other weapon builds, because not only does it have really good base damage, but with the Berserker Mastery Tree it also has a significant amount of sustain and self-heal. The weapon itself scales primarily off strength, with dexterity as its secondary. This, at least in my opinion, makes it one of the few weapons that are very viable to work with as a ranged secondary weapon, because it has that high base damage. For example, you could run this with a musket, and you'd spec your attribute points into dexterity. This would mean the musket gets maximum damage, and whilst the hatchet would lose a little bit compared to if it's scaled off strength, it would still be a very effective weapon. It's also one of the few weapons that scales entirely off of one mastery tree, rather than a combination of the two, which most of the builds here we're going to look at do. And that tree is of course the Berserker tree. Yes, you're losing out on any of the hatchet's ranged ability, but the sustain you're going to be getting from Berserker is hugely useful in keeping yourself alive in both PvE and PvP fights. This, combined with the great burst damage, makes it a really viable weapon in my opinion. For attack combination, you're generally going to be wanting to activate Berserker from the off. I'd then be getting stuck in with a few light attacks before probably activating Feral Rush, particularly if the target turns their back at any point, because remember, Feral Rush gives a 2-second route to enemies if you get a hit from behind, so if the opportunity to land that rear hit occurs, absolutely make it, because a 2-second route is hugely useful, and if you get that 2-second route you can then follow up with the Raging Torrent for that huge amounts of burst damage. And that's really, for me, in that sort of combination, what makes the hatchet a very viable weapon, even though it has had quite a few nerfs from where it was in the alpha. Okay, so we have covered the hatchet, and I'm now going to move on to the musket, since we talked about the hatchet being sort of a viable pair with a ranged weapon. The musket is a really interesting one for me, and one I've actually been trying out during the beta, because it has insanely high alpha damage. Yes, it shoots slowly, its actual base DPS probably isn't that high, but its range and lack of drop-off is huge, and it can take big chunks out of the enemy's health, particularly if you manage to hit headshots. For that reason, I've gone for the approach of only using 2 abilities here, with everything else in the Mastery tree being spec'd towards increasing that burst damage to maximising those big hits and hopefully occasional one-shots. The first ability is Powder Burn, which not only gives good base damage, but applies a 9-second ticking burn damage to the enemy, which is actually increased to 13 seconds in the event of a headshot. The second ability, Power Shot. This is going to give you 150% base damage, which gets even higher with a headshot, and is just a great base alpha damage ability. Combination wise, I'm going to try and hit them with the Powder Burn first. Not only will this take a reasonable chunk of health out of them, but it's going to apply that burn damage. You know, if the enemy stops to heal to deal with that, then I'm going to be trying to go for that headshot with the Power Shot, which should hopefully do significant critical damage, and maybe actually enough to finish them off. It may seem like this is kind of a not very well-rounded build. It's quite niche, it's quite focused in what I'm trying to use it for, but I think that's what makes it work so well. And you're using this in combination as a secondary weapon. Yes, it's not the most rounded class, but what it does it pretty excellently. Well, with the musket out of the way, I want to move on to the spear, a weapon I haven't actually yet used in the beta, but have previously enjoyed. It's capable of dealing pretty large amounts of damage in small bursts, yet also capable of locking enemies down with some of its debuffs. Interestingly, the spear actually primaries with dexterity, with strength as a secondary attribute. Abilities wise, I think I would be looking to make use of Vault Kick, Perforate and Sweep. You know, I'd be trying to use the Vault Kick to sort of stun and lock the enemies down, to then really allow me to get much closer in. And then I'd probably be trying to make use of Perforate to get the maximum damage against them, before then trying to follow up with Sweep, to stop the enemies from actually being able to activate any of their abilities, stop them from being able to heal themselves, and then hopefully you can just get back onto the normal light and heavy attacks during everything else on cooldown, and hopefully by that point the enemy should be dead. The spear is probably a little bit more difficult to pick up than some of the other weapons we have in the game. When I first got my hands on it during the Rootwater preview event sometime last year, it certainly had me fairly confused. And yeah, picked up some pretty horrible footage of me playing it terribly. So it certainly is a class that can be a little bit difficult to learn initially. Next up, we have got the Ice Gauntlet, a weapon that was actually only very recently revealed and added into the game. But the Ice Gauntlet is very good for keeping objectives and punishing users who stay in one position for a prolonged period of time. Essentially, the Gauntlet puts the playing field in your hands, making enemies leave an area of play or face a constant barrage of attacks. The main abilities I'd probably be looking to recommend for Ice Gauntlet are going to be Pylon, Ice Storm and Entombed. And as for how these are going to work in a combo, you ideally want to make sure you're getting your Ice Pylon placed down right at the start. And then you're basically trying to spend time avoiding the enemies, trying to prevent them from getting too close to you, because all the while whilst this is going on, the Pylon is starting to shoot at the enemies. If, however, they do get too close to you, you can activate Ice Storm to slow them down and apply damage, all the while you're making use of these light and heavy attacks to continuously apply damage to the enemies as they're trying to catch up to you. If you then find yourself basically out of mana, or found yourself in a bad spot, you can then always activate your Entombed to regenerate your mana pool very quickly. It's also probably worth adding that the AoE of Ice Storm can be extremely effective in wars, where it can cover an objective and basically force groups of enemies off a certain point. It allows you to sort of control a zone of area and keep people from going on a spot that you don't want them to be in, which can make it such a valuable class during wars. I feel like the bow is a weapon that has kind of struggled slightly more recently in popularity. It's just not something that I've really been seeing that much used during the beta. But it can still be a hugely effective weapon in what it can do, and is kind of like the ultimate fast-acting range DPS class, which can put out really good amounts of damage at range. Like the musket, the bow of course requires arrows, or ammunition in the case of the musket, so you've always got to have this stuff in your inventory, always make sure you are stocked up. But for the mastery build, I'd be wanting to use the abilities of Poison Shot, Evade Shot, and Penetrating Shot. Essentially, with the exception of the Evade Shot, you are always trying to make use of these highly damaging abilities. If the enemies stay in one place or run out of stamina, you should be using Poison Shot and Penetrating Shot to punish them for their mistakes. But if they start to bear down on you or get too close, making use of Evade Shot is a great way of breaking contact and sort of putting some distance between yourself and the enemy. It's also worth remembering that Poison Shot does have an AoE effect, which can make it kind of effective against clusters of enemy. It can be a very effective weapon, the bow, and you're also trying to make use of, regular light and heavy attacks, and obviously trying to land those headshots when you can. The rapier can make for an absolutely fantastic DPS weapon, as it has really high crit chance rates and some pretty gnarly bleed effects, which can take down enemies over time quite effectively, which means that, on paper at least, rapier can really be one of the most damaging weapons in the game. Like the spear, the rapier actually primaries with dexterity, but instead has intelligence as its secondary scaling attribute. But in terms of the mastery abilities that I'd probably wanting to be used with the rapier, I'd be looking at Tondo, Evade, and Flesh. In terms of playstyle though, you're basically trying to initially make use of Tondo to slash and stab from a bit of a distance because it extends your blade, and trying to start applying those bleed stacks to the enemy. If the range gets closer, you can continue to follow up with light attacks until you're in danger, the enemy's trying to lock you down or trying to counter you. Then you're going to be trying to activate your Evade. This not only gives you the temporary invulnerability, but it's also giving you that sidestep to get yourself out of danger and dodge those enemies' abilities. If you then get an opening, you can follow up with Flesh to lunge forwards and get that stab in, doing that really high base damage, going for that nice hit. Although, I guess it's also worth pointing out that Flesh can also be used just as an escape skill to put some distance between yourself and the enemy. And of course, throughout this whole thing, those bleed stacks that you remember you applied with Tondo at the start are still racking up damage against the enemy. Fire Staff. Actually, a weapon I have never used in either the beta or the alpha, so I had to go out and find some experts on this one to find out about the best builds for the Fire Staff. And more than likely, unless I've suddenly fell head over heels in love with it in the beta, I won't actually have any footage by the time this gets edited, because I do want to get this video out before the beta ends, so you're now probably just looking at the mastery screen. But I hope it should still be very useful all the same. The Fire Staff is the hardest hitting magic weapon in the game so far. It has the high crit chance and can also make use of ranged or close-up attacks to burn its foes to death. In terms of mastery abilities though, I'd probably be recommending Fireball, Incinerate and Burnout. But it's worth bearing in mind that on this one, on the mastery, the passives are also really important. When in combat, you should generally be making use of heavy attacks, as they're not going to be using mana with some of the passives selected in this build. And if the enemies do become too stationary, you can make use of Fireball to set them and the ground underneath them on fire and sort of build up some of that stacking damage. If they start to get too close to you, you can also make use of Incinerate or Burnout to drive them back and put some distance between them and yourself before returning to the previous heavy attacks. I guess it's probably also worth mentioning that if you're a very heavy PvE focused player, then you may also consider Flamethrower, but I think it's generally considered that the above build is a bit of a better all-round build. The healer is probably the most important class in the game, and the Life Staff is currently the only healing weapon available. You know, if you and your group want to run expeditions, wars, invasions and world bosses, then you will be needing a healer. Whilst it's also one of the most thankless jobs in the game, it can also be one of the hardest, as you're trying to manage multiple other players at the same time, keeping an eye on not only their own health and adjusting your play accordingly to keep them all in the fight, and all the while you're also trying to avoid danger and trying to not get yourself killed in the fight yourself. But for weapon mastery abilities, I would be selecting Divine Embrace, Sacred Ground and Beacon. But I'm going to go on to suggest two different playstyles for PvE and PvP healing. So for PvE, I would recommend constantly using light attacks to heal allies. If a player then drops below something like 70% health, then you would want to use Divine Embrace on them. If, however, one of your allies is being continuously attacked, such as the team tank, then use Sacred Ground, as this will help recover not only their health, but also their mana and their stamina as well. And if things get really tight, things start to go really badly when you're fighting those world bosses, you can always call upon Beacon to target a specific person or as an AoE. And yes, it does combine with Sacred Ground to give 30% extra healing in the AoE circle. However, for PvP, or more specifically Territory Wars, then things are going to be a little bit different. Your primary aim is going to be to keep at the back and stay alive. You're then going to be making use of Divine Embrace on basically anyone whose health is getting low, and frankly in a 50v50 fight that is going to be a lot of people. When you start to run out of mana though, you're going to either have to pop a potion, which hopefully you've brought with you to the war, or you can use Sacred Ground upon yourself and wait for your mana to regen. But if you find yourself starting to get targeted by enemies, then you can actually still target yourself with control and clicking the skill. You know, make sure to throw a Sacred Ground and Beacon down on the ground and heal yourself, and then you can use Divine Embrace on yourself with that control click ability. Healing is certainly one of the more challenging jobs in New World, but as I kind of mentioned earlier, it's also one of the most important and is absolutely critical for any group in either PvE or PvP combat. Being secondary to perhaps only healer, the job of the tank is hugely important in New World, and there really isn't a better weapon to use for it than Sword and Shield. It is the primary tanking weapon. It is the only weapon in the game that can block projectiles. Well, I guess at least the shield part of it does anyway. But it also produces a lot of threat, which means it is far easier with the Sword and Shield to gain and hold aggro from enemies than any other weapon. This is, going to allow the healer to focus on just one player rather than trying to manage a lot of them, and the DPS classes to safely apply their damage without being able to sort of quickly taken out by the bosses. The weapon itself scales primarily off strength, with dexterity as its secondary. And in terms of the mastery abilities you should be taking, Whirling Wind, Shield Bash, and Final Stand. And in PvE fights, you are constantly trying to gain and keep hold of the aggro from the enemy. You're using Shield Bash and Final Stand while making use of Whirlwind and light attacks to apply a little bit of damage, which in turn helps increase your threat and helps you to keep that aggro. This can also be bolstered by slotting a Carnelian Gem on the sword, which also significantly increases threat. But your primary goal for the whole of this is to keep the threat, keep the focus of the enemies on you, so the rest of your team can deal with them. In PvP, however, things are slightly different. You want to be on the front line, getting close to the enemies, making more use of your heavy attacks. If advancing on range users, make sure to use your block to reduce the chance of getting hit and taking range damage, and try and get close enough to make use of your Shield Bash, stun them in place before following up with heavy and light attacks to slowly chunk them down. It's not necessarily one of the most glamorous jobs in the game being a tank, but the Sword and Shield does it very well, and it is a key part to any team. So we have two weapons left to go, Great Axe and Warhammer. You may be wondering why I left these two as the last of the two to run through, but it's because, in my opinion, they both make great secondary weapons for a tank. To take Warhammer first, it is great for locking down enemies and creating AoE, and it makes for a fantastic secondary weapon and can be swapped into stun, slow and knock down enemies. It's also worth pointing out that the Warhammer is only going to be scaling off strength, but in terms of the mastery abilities, I would recommend you take Mighty Gavel, Shockwave and Path of Destiny. You can then use Mighty Gavel to knock down your enemies, Shockwave to stun your enemies, and Path of Destiny to slow your enemies, giving you a really great amount of crowd control, which is why it's such a nice sort of accompaniment to the Sword and Shield, which has very little. I'd finally end on the Warhammer by pointing out that despite being very slow, the Warhammer's heavy attacks do hit super hard, so if you can land them, they are well worth using. And so last but certainly not least, we have the Great Axe, which, as I mentioned above, also makes for a great pairing with tanks, as the passive perks on the tree allowed you to build up and deal out damage to enemies who stay close to you due to the stacking damage per hit, so you're not really losing out much not having all your attribute points in strength. As with the Warhammer, Great Axe... Hi guys, what is going on? And welcome back to another video on New World. So today we're going to be really taking sort of a deep dive down into crafting. I've kind of made no hidden fact that crafting has kind of been my favourite thing about New World so far. And so today I kind of wanted to break that down in detail, go into more detail about gathering, refining, and kind of what I'm calling like end products. And then we're going to go in about resource locations, where I'm gathering from, how to level quickly, and sort of also talk a little bit about focusing into one kind of end product tech tree because kind of the limitations you come into. So let's get stuck into the guide. So I'm not going to break down how to mine a rock or how to skin an animal because this is all stuff you'll be taught in the basic tutorial. But fundamentally, I want to talk about the fact that gathering is broken down into 4 key skills. And these are all skills that you're going to be leveling up because unlike some of the later tier stuff where you can sort of cut out certain ones, you're going to be pretty much needing all of these. Obviously logging, cutting trees, mining, gathering things like iron, silver, gold, harvesting, things like fibre for weaving, also herb gathering for cooking, tracking and skinning. Obviously it's just about basically getting hide for leatherworking. And at least initially you'll find there's actually a fairly minimal amount of resources you're going to be trying to target. Logging, obviously you're going to find trees everywhere, so that's really not a problem you're going to have to be dealing with. But harvesting and tracking, effectively in terms of harvesting, all you're going to be looking for realistically is hemp, because this is going to be giving you your fibre for creating linen, and you're also going to be interested in basically an efficient way of skinning. In the tutorial you'll end up skinning a boar, And you'll see a lot of people talking about skinning things like wolves, which you can do, but you're going to be gathering maybe 20 hide per wolf, and it's quite an inefficient way of doing it. So, for example, I think the key to this is to try and find an efficient route. By making use of things like the resource locations on here, you can get an idea of where works and where doesn't. For me, I'm currently based out of Monarch's Bluff, but ideally it's located between Everfall and Windswood. This location here is the perfect spot. Not only does it have ample amounts of hemp, so it makes it very good for gathering your fibres, it also has creatures called bison, which are classed as sort of a large creature, so they give around 100 hide per skinning session. This makes gathering a lot more efficient, particularly when you consider that fibre actually doesn't take up very much inventory space, and you can be gathering large amounts of hide and large amounts of fibre fairly quickly from this area while not being too far from either settlement. So this is a great place to get started. Moving on from that, the only other thing you're really going to need to worrying about is mining, and that's gathering iron. Now, it is worth trying to get your mining up to 25 quite early on, because this little tracked bonus is kind of handy. It does mean that when you go to a forest area, you're going to get a little icon like we saw earlier on, and that makes it quite a lot easier to find where you're going to be going. I then try and set up basically a mining route. In my case, I come in here and there's like a little circuit around here, but I'm just going to show you over onto a map now, and that'll give you a much better idea of how you can set up your resource gathering routes to try and increase your resource gathering efficiency. So this map that someone has created is actually a hugely valuable resource, and I'll put a link to it down in the description and in the comments down below. But this basically enables you to search for resource locations, and that is hugely useful. So, for example, as we were just talking about, I'm based out of Monarch's Bluff, and if you saw on the little mini-map, I was working basically around here on my iron mining route. So by heading over to the search, we can basically add in any material we want. So if we're looking for iron veins, and we can see, actually, it's a fairly logical route. I head up here, basically cut down, and basically do a loop, and that's enough for me to pretty well fill my inventory. Although, as I'm leveling up, I'm getting access to larger bags, so that is making things a little bit easier. So trying to set up a route like that is hugely important. Now, because of this map, it doesn't really matter where you're based. Say if you're based down here in Windswood, you know you're not going to be wanting to push out north because there's nothing really easily around. But by looking down here, we can see there's quite an easy route around here. You can quite easily set up a circle. It's not going to take you very long to run, and it's going to get you access to a large amount of iron quite easily and quite early on. That is important because it enables you to really increase your efficiency. If you just wander around aimlessly, don't really know where you're going, it's going to take you so much longer to get an inventory full of iron. So try to make targeted known routes, and then once you've ran this 5 or 6 times, you'll probably just be able to remember the route without even referring to the map. That makes gathering in this sort of instance a lot quicker. And of course you can do this for other things. We can turn iron off, and we can search for fibre if we wanted to. I was actually just having a look at silkweed earlier on to try and get some silk fibres. But if you want to look at hemp, you can see why I suggested this area down here with bison, because it's such a resource-rich area, and it makes gathering so much more efficient than trying to just find the 1 or 2 that are dotted around elsewhere. So setting up these resource routes is really important, and be sure to make use of this map. Before we get too much into refining, one thing we do just need to point out is that actually leveling up your character, even if you're pretty much a purely PvE crafter and not interested in any of the PvE or PvP elements, getting up to level 30 and then level 45 are really important for a few reasons. Mostly for the bags. As a crafter, you're going to be doing a lot of gathering, and the biggest limitation you have is this weight limit here. See, I've just been, after the first bit of the video, just been gathering some iron, and getting these 2 bags to add 150 weight each, at level 30, gives you so much more flexibility in your production. You can gather so much more material. Getting to level 30 is crucial, and getting decent high quality bags is really important. And then as you level up to the next stage, you get tier 4 bags, and you get to 45, you get access to the section. It's also important things like, for example, very briefly, say like at making steel, which is a level 20, and smelting is super important to for example oil, which you're realistically going to be getting from over here you'll find very high tier to achieve that. Once you start to get to those higher tier crafting materials, well as doing your crafting. So you've been gathering resources, you've sort of started to get some of your gathering skills up a little bit, and you've started to do some basic refining. You know, you've been doing your fibre into linen, doing hide to coarse leather. You've been doing some of the basic refining stuff. Ultimately, you've kind of got to make a decision about what you want to be producing as your end-tier products. Now, in my case, I ended up going down engineering. A couple of reasons. Largely, I'm a bow player, so I wanted to be starting to get onto the higher tier bows. But also, engineering gives you full access to the other steel, and well, so actually now getting close to that. So for me, engineering is kind of to go. I've had to put a fair amount of time and effort just to get this engineering skill up a reasonable amount. If I then spread out into armouring, weaponsmithing, maybe did a little bit of jewel crafting on the side, you'll find that all my end tier crafting things will be like around level 10, and it's never going to really get you very far. It requires an exponentially larger amount of time and resources each time you go from gathering to refining to end products. So by the time you get over here to one of your end products, you're going to need a lot more time and effort just to level your skill. Because to create something like a bow, you know, you're requiring decent weaving potential, you need decent leatherworking potential, you need decent logging and woodworking skills just to get this one high quality bow. There's a lot of effort from it. And that's kind of my point in saying I tend to think it's worth focusing in on one end crafting tech tree. And that's why it's particularly good if you're in a clan, because elsewhere in the guild I'm in Crown Disorder, elsewhere in the guild people are doing weaponsmithing, so if I want to craft a tier 4 sword, I can go to them and say, oh, you know, I'll pay you to do this, or if you do that, I'll craft you a bow or some steel tools or something like that. And so that makes it a lot more accessible because you don't have to focus in on each individual one. And while eventually, okay, if you want to, you can do, at least in the initial game, I think you're much better off focusing on getting one up to the high level. So you in this case, getting access to lumber, getting access to rugged leather, and also getting access to this sateen, this tier 3 cloth, is going to be a key requirement because that's the required materials basically for all tier 3 engineering equipment, all tier 3 armouring. You know, you're going to require steel, leather and that cloth, and these are all going to be key requirements. But not only that, once eventually you start pushing on higher onto level 35, you're still going to require some of the previous material. Now the other thing you'll find that you require are crafting components. So you see here, for using leather, you require tannin. For making lumber, oops, that's leatherworking. For making lumber with woodworking, you require sandpaper. And these are the crafting materials that you're going to find in crates around the open world as you explore. For example, if we head into this house here, you'll see that just here there's a supply crate. We can just search this. You'll get given these quite a few in missions to accomplish. And there we go, we've got 7 solvent and 4 sandpaper, as well as some slightly crappy duelist boots. Always be picking up these supply crates as you see them in the open world. You're always going to be short and need these crafting components because they are key elements of the crafting process, and they're a limitation on every single stage, and being short on them is going to be a real limiting factor for you. So make sure you search quests and chests whenever you see them in the open world. So enough theory crafting, let's actually craft ourselves some steel. Now one little thing you can note is that your storage shed interacts with the town. So for example, all this iron ore we've got here, I don't actually need to have this on my person to turn this into iron. So let's just throw that into my back here in the storage shed. And then if we head over to the smelter over here, you see that we still actually have access to this iron, though it's no longer in my bag. So that does mean that it makes it quite easier to so at least in yes, we've got 325 base. That's what we
You
to get.
come closer.
8
bonus iron bar.
Devil's Storm.
Now that was because as
Something
your
isn't
crafting
right.
increases,
To
we
come
have
so
level
close.
size smeltering, you
It's
get
not
slightly
fair.
increased chance to gain additional items. No matter what the quality of the material is. So the higher you are on a certain level, the more of each resource you're going to be getting in terms of a little bit of a bonus. At least at the level that I'm at currently, in kind of the lower levels, it's not much of a bonus. But when you've been playing for a long time, focusing down into one certain tree, getting a sort of 10 or 20% craft bonus is actually quite useful, particularly when you start to get onto some of the much rarer and valuable ores that you can come across. So what else do we need to make steel? It looks like we use the oil, which we actually have in our shed. Now, oil is kind of one of these rare resources that is only found in marshland. Currently the best place to get oil is over in Weaver's Fen. As you'll see, this is all considered marshland. It is like a level 30 or 25 to 30 area because you do encounter some really high tier stuff. But remember, if you're really lost, you can always hop back to that spreadsheet, the map that I showed you earlier, turn on the oil and kind of find where you're going to be wanting to go. And it also looks like we need to get ourselves some charcoal, which we're currently really short on. Looks like we have a little bit of wood, although not all that much. In reality, I could just go out and get some more of this from outside of town. Just getting access to the basic wood is really the easiest way to gather. But for now, let's use this simply create some charcoal. There we go. We've got one as a bonus, always nice. And now it should give us access to enough materials to actually craft a few steel bars. Because we have the iron ingots, the charcoal, and the oil now at our disposal. Did we get a bonus? Unfortunately not this time. But there we go, and that gives us access to some steel. So that's kind of the key component in crafting a lot of the things that I'm aiming for, particularly a lot of the axes, high-end tier tools. So just before we move away from refining and onto talking about the perks, gem slots, and using Azoth in crafting, I just wanted to talk about the fact that crafting and refining materials is exponentially complicated. So obviously initially when you're just doing rawhide to coarse leather, it's pretty basic stuff. But once you move on to rugged leather, you actually have to take your rawhide to coarse leather, to then take it to the rugged leather, and then you need tannin to do that. It's getting a little bit more complex, but not unachievably so. But then you move on to tier 4. Now you need rugged leather as a base starting material. That means to get that you've got to have your coarse leather